The Dead Space remake, even though it's only the first quarter of the year, will go on to be one of the best games of 2023. It's indisputable. I was 50-50 on it at first, but it eventually won me over and led to me having so much fun that I started a New Game Plus just to enjoy it some more. What I'd like to focus on in this video is how the game introduces its most important mechanics, incentivizes you to use them, and the overall balance of the experience, and how certain changes affect the game in both positive and negative ways. I'll be back with a second video that covers everything else, like story and graphics and exploration and all that. I played the Dead Space remake on hard, which, if you're experienced with the series or fairly competent with shooters, is an absolute must. As we know, Dead Space is the game that made itself famous for its dismemberment mechanic. They wanted you to cut off the arms and legs of enemies instead of going for your typical body shots and headshots, or butt shots if you play like me. It made its gameplay stand out amongst other action titles and horror titles. It's not a mechanic you have to constantly engage in, as you get other weapons throughout the game that allow you to deal damage more conventionally, but the dismemberment mechanic is the selling point on the gameplay. It's what the game was designed around to begin with, and many players that replay Dead Space tend to dedicate themselves entirely to the plasma cutter and dismember enemies from start to finish. The original Dead Space is far from a perfectly balanced game. I think a lot of players would tell you that Dead Space 2 is a far more interesting and challenging experience due to the way they tune the gameplay around its movement and weapons, and especially the very aggressive AI. But the original is fairly well done, and does a respectable job at getting you into the fun zone that it offers. The main difference between Dead Space 1 and Dead Space 2 on high difficulty is that Dead Space 1 basically just beefs up the enemy health a bit and the damage they deal out, while Dead Space 2 adds a very effective reduction to your resources on the Zealot difficulty, which is available on a first playthrough. With less of an abundance of ammo for any one gun, you're using more of your arsenal. There's more pressure to actually buy ammo from the store, which hurts your ability to dump all your credits into power nodes to upgrade your gear. For an action horror title like Dead Space, this resource change helps nudge it a little more in the survival horror direction. A little. So it's very, very disappointing to see that the hard difficulty of the Dead Space remake only scales up enemy damage and HP. It unfortunately leads to the first 4 chapters pretty much feeling quite tame for players who know what they're doing. You are flushed with ammunition throughout this period, and it had me questioning whether or not I was enjoying the game beyond the nice graphics and remixed environments. Eventually the game starts to balance itself out a little better, especially if you're trying to buy power nodes. I felt like I was getting less of the resources I needed from combat, resulting in me having to dedicate credits to ammo purchases, and I started getting pushed into experimenting with other options, which was satisfying. Those opening chapters do feel a bit off though. I feel like hard mode is balanced in its early levels not to scare off new players, and there should have been a hardcore mode offered at the beginning, just like how Dead Space 2 offers Zealot. Here's where we get into an aspect of this remake that has me very conflicted, and this is in regards to the hard difficulty. The inability to quickly dismember enemies with the plasma cutter in the early chapters due to high enemy damage resistance and the overall lack of oomph in the plasma cutter compared to the original, in my experience and I'm sure in some others, led to more experimentation with my other guns. Part of this is due to the big change of simply giving you new weapons instead of having to craft them at the shop. It was always tempting to not get a lot of weapons in the originals due to having to pay for them, and now you just get them as you play. By level 6 you have all weapons, so why not play around with them? Especially if you're running out of ammo for the guns you like at that point, or those guns aren't getting the job done for you in high pressure situations. The increased inventory also plays a big part in this. Whereas the original Dead Space started you with 10 inventory slots and allowed you to expand by 2 every time you upgraded your suit, the Dead Space remake gives you 12 slots and upgrades by 6, and then another 4 each time after. It's a massive difference, and it allows you to carry every weapon with you comfortably, which honestly works very well for the fast action focus of this game's combat. Another big factor is the rebalancing and reimagining of your arsenal. The classic weapons are all here, but critical aspects have been improved or redesigned completely. The pulse rifle's alt-fire is similar to the grenade of Dead Space 2, but actually doubles as a proximity mine. The force gun's alt-fire is now a vortex that sucks in enemies around it. The contact beam now fires a steady laser as long as you hold the button, with its former primary fire charge attack now being the alt-fire mode. Very cool change. The flamethrower alt-fire sets down a long burning firewall, stopping many enemies in their tracks, a great defensive tool, and my favorite change comes from the line gun. Now, I've always been in love with the mine alt-fire from the originals, and at first I was disappointed to see it had changed. There's just nothing better than throwing it down and using stasis and watching everything explode. But hot damn, changing the alt-fire into a laser trap was a brilliant move. We already have an explosive with the pulse rifle, so to give that gun's ability a more standout identity, the line gun's alt-fire now sets these long-reaching and long-burning lasers that can get enemies stuck in them, doing damage, and when they're upgraded to do a lot more damage, and eventually have 3 lasers per trap instead of 1, they become a devastating defensive option.
Hazardous anomaly detected. Quarantine activated.
And in what may be the most broken ability in the game, or in any game I've seen in recent memory, you can attach these lasers onto objects that can be picked up with Kinesis and everything just burns. You might be saying, holy shit Mayo, that's so busted it should be fixed. But my view on exploits like this is that if the game has already done a good job at getting you into a fun playstyle, and you've already had enough time to fall in love with it, introducing something entirely too powerful later on is not that big of a deal. It's not like you start the game with it. Though I would definitely be understanding to a big nerf to its duration, or possibly making it cost a lot more ammo. But that brings me to the Ripper. The Ripper, in my opinion, does a lot of damage to the early game experience for a first-time player. I felt it myself, and when I invited a friend over to play the game, I saw it happen to him too. One shot from the Ripper lasts long enough to kill an enemy completely, even 2 enemies, and it keeps them in infinite stun. That's probably the worst part about it. It's a mindless and easy way to pass the majority of combat encounters, and that would be fine if other aspects of it were rebalanced. You can hold so many blades without reloading, and the amount of blades given to you through item drops in combat and exploring is absurd. I think this gun should only hold 1 blade in its capacity, having to reload after every shot, with a very long reload time. Make it something you use in an emergency, not something you just use to bully through 80% of the enemies you see. Or maybe the Ripper just shouldn't infinitely stunlock enemies. Or maybe the damage should be scaled down so that a single blade isn't enough to kill someone. It would feel better if you did combos like 3 plasma shots plus 1 Ripper blade to take someone down. Because the combination of tanky enemies that take a lot of plasma shots to dismember in the early game, and a boring, simple one-shot kill option in the Ripper ends up damaging the defining principle of Dead Space's unique style of gameplay, and that's the dismemberment mechanic. And the reason I say I'm conflicted on it is because this is both a positive and negative thing. If you're struggling to take off legs and arms quickly, you'll feel more pressure to use stasis, and that's fun. If you're getting overwhelmed, you'll want to switch to the pulse rifle and use the alt-fire to blow them up. Setting down a wall of fire will give you some breathing room, and then you'll pull out the Ripper. It's good variety. There are so many good options that work together to create awesome combat moments. On top of that, we add the inclusion of Dead Space 2's Kinesis abilities. You can pick up metal rods to impale enemies, doing massive damage. 2 shots will kill most of them, and though the game doesn't explicitly tell you this, you can pick up enemy blades and impale with them too. It's just as awesome as it was in Dead Space 2. This is great, right? This is what I always talk about on my channel. Games incentivizing you and pushing you into using the interesting options they provide. Through challenge and education, it creates dynamic gameplay by sparking the creativity in your mind out of a need for survival. We even have some enemy-specific weaknesses that encourage the use of certain weapons, like how the flamethrower will instantly break the stasis charge on the Twitcher, or the alt-fire insta-killing the wall guardians. But something is lost at the same time, because I worry some players new to the franchise will end up not engaging with the dismemberment mechanic much past the first few chapters. And I'm not saying that didn't happen in the other games, they aren't perfectly balanced either. It's just that this being a remake of Dead Space 1, the game that introduced this mechanic, they should do a better job of getting you into using it out of a sense of necessity, and more importantly, enjoying it, so that you don't completely ignore it once you unlock better options. They've basically put Dead Space 2's combat abilities into Dead Space 1, but they haven't quite tuned the encounters or the resources to fit it appropriately. I think making the game play more like Dead Space 2 with the powerful alt-fire modes, the more fluid movement, and the impaling Kinesis abilities that allow you to save significant amounts of ammo is a mistake without also adjusting the resources dropped during combat. If you play this game like Dead Space 2, which I feel like they want you to, the game doesn't consistently deliver the intensity of combat or resource pressure that it needs to. However, in my experience, it did eventually start feeling better in the second half of the game. I had a lot of fun, I found interesting tactics to rely on, I still engaged in dismemberment mixed into everything else. Despite my grievances and disagreements with certain aspects, I still think the Dead Space remake generally succeeds at what it wants to accomplish in the action department. But it absolutely needs a zealot difficulty, and maybe even some custom difficulty options. I mean, hey, Shredder's Revenge patched in a custom games mode to enable cheats and modifiers to make the game easier or harder. Give us that and we'll be very happy. But combat isn't the only thing Dead Space offers. There's much more to talk about, so please join me in the next video where we'll discuss everything else to varying degrees. Subscribe to this channel, I'm Under the Mayo, thanks for watching this video, give me another week or so and I'll be back with the rest.